Hello there and a warm welcome to Property Question Time here on Property TV. My name's Jo Price. This is the show where we take your questions and property issues and direct them to our panel of property experts. And joining me today we have the lovely Marianne Bowring, welcome back, who's founding director of the Ringley Group. To her right is Tony Gimple, founding director of Less Tax for Landlords. And last but certainly not least, we've got Paul Mahoney, who is the MD of Nova Financial. Thank you all for joining us again in our beautiful garden room. First question to you, Marianne. What is block management?
Well, that question probably depends who you ask. If you ask perhaps a letting or traditional estate agent, they'll just think of it as managing the common parts. In the same way that you manage a property, so that'll be about repairs, etc. Perhaps if you ask a service charge manager, they'll be more focused on setting budgets, spending the money right, sorting out whose liability is what, understanding leases in order to not spend money but actually get the right person to fulfil their liabilities. Perhaps if you ask a risk-based property manager, then they'll be talking about compliance, fire safety, equipment, etc. The truth is all of those facets are part of block management, but you need to be very careful that you actually choose the right expert for the facilities and features of the building that you actually live in.
Okay, I hadn't got a clue what it meant, so I'm glad you've...
It's effectively managing the whole building rather than managing a flat.
Okay.
So if you think of lettings management is me renting your flat and you managing me in the flat and that relationship, whereas block management is everything else. So perhaps if you look at the service charge budget, that'll be everything from cleaning, gardening, insurance, a reserve fund for future repairs, the managing agent's fee, accountancy costs, and everything else that's sort of perhaps intangible but goes on to keep that building running.
Okay, so that would relate to you then if you were expanding your portfolio and maybe buying 4 flats in one building, is that right? Or...
Well, if you bought 4 flats in one building and the 4 flats was the whole building, then effectively you would be managing your own flats plus the building.
Okay.
So you would be the block manager and the lettings manager. If you bought 1 flat in a building with 4 flats, then you would have an interest in paying, well, you'd have to pay your service charge, and you'd have an interest in A, who's managing it, are they managing it effectively, and how much will my service charge cost? Is there a reserve fund in place for the future? Because if there isn't, and perhaps the roof needed replacing next year, you could be presented with a very big bill quite quickly.
Okay, so there could be a few issues there. You need to really understand what it means. Who is the block management company before you... Yeah.
There's a lot of self-managed situations which can get dysfunctional and difficult to work. It's all very well when, let's say the 4 of us are friends living in a block and we get the electricity bill, effectively split it in 4, pay our bit each, and that works really well until I decide I haven't got any money or I don't want to pay my service charge. Then relationships in the building can start to break down. You might not know enough about the lease and how to enforce things upon me to, I don't know, perhaps keep my property in repair, not have tenants making noise and nuisance at night, and how to get me to pay my share. And therefore that's the stage where getting a third-party professional to take the sting out of the bad stuff will keep everything working correctly.
Keep those communication channels open. Okay, Thank you, Marianne. Coming to you now, Tony. So, my partner and I will be looking to buy a property together very soon. She will be a first-time buyer, and we intend to live in this property and to make it our home. I will provide a 50% deposit, and she will take care of the mortgage payments. I know that warning bells will be ringing, and I realise that certain risks will be taken, but surely some legal arrangements can be drawn up to at least half protect interests. Is it possible that the mortgage is purely in her name but ownership is in both names, or will I have to accept that the mortgage is joint and take responsibility on paper for the payment? It's an interesting question. I'm sure this comes up quite a lot.
Thank you for that. Does he have another property?
Okay.
So there might be a stamp duty implication. There's a lot more behind the question. Let me see if I can answer some of the key points. There are 2 ways of owning property typically: joint tenants and tenants in common. As joint tenants, the law assumes that you and I say have one legal personality. What's mine is mine, and what's yours is mine, as they say. Doesn't differentiate between us. Both jointly and severally liable. And you have what's called tenants in common, where you each own a defined share. Usually 50-50, but it can be unequal. and we're each held separate from each other. Can the land registry be in joint names and the mortgage in one? Potentially, depends on the lender. Can you protect your position? Yeah, you can have a simple declaration, a letter of trust saying, whilst I'm paying the mortgage, I hold you safe.
Yes.
If I sell it, you get 50%. Very important though, whichever way they own it, they've got wills reflecting their share. And if both signatures are required at any stage, they need what's called a lasting power of attorney for their property and financial affairs. So if one of them is not quite dead but not quite alive either and they need to sell the property, it saves having to go to court to do it. Not a simple question though, and would need a lot more detail to give a definitive answer, but yes, both parties can protect each other's interests.
Could I ask a quick question? If they were married, would that make a difference? And if they were getting married, say they were buying the house together? No. Okay, no protection there then.
No, I mean, if you're married, everything automatically passes to your spouse.
Okay.
On death, and if you both sign, and there can be, as an implicit joint and several guarantee as well when it comes to debt. If you don't specify otherwise. So no, whether you're married, single, shacked up, civil partnership, whatever, business partners, living or sharing the ownership of a property, you need to do the detail and understand it in the wider concept, but you can protect each other's interests.
Yeah, a bit of a minefield there, I think. You really do need to take advice on that. Thank you, Tony. Coming to you now, Paul. I'm close to completion on the sale of my house. I've arranged to move into rented accommodation while I continue my search for a new home for a minimum of a 6-month period, but obviously have a large lump sum of cash to invest, which is more than 300,000. Can you advise the best way that I can make this money work for me while I continue my search for a new home? Interesting one. Only 6 months.
Yeah, so 6 months is obviously a short period of time. And the answer is there's loads of things you could invest that money into. Whether you should or not is the question. Especially given those funds are for your home. And therefore you would think that your risk profile for that sum of money is pretty low. So probably, given that risk is very much aligned with return, and given that it's a short period of time, the best bet would be to put it into some sort of term deposit or something. And you're not going to get a very good return given the way that interest rates are at the moment. But I'd say that lack of return is better than the risk you'd be taking to get a better return, given that you're going to need, I assume, all of that money in a period of 6 months or thereabouts. Some things to potentially consider is that there's quite a few crowdfunding type platforms available at the moment. Some do it a lot better than others. That you could spread those funds and apply them for a period of 6 months, and that might sort of lift your return a little bit. Again, seeking personal advice on something like this is very important, and I can't give that based upon that small snapshot of information. But I'd say probably for the sake of 6 months, you're better off foregoing a higher return to keep that money safe.
Yeah, safety and also instant access to that money as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's nothing worse than not having a home and then losing money in an investment and then not being able to afford the same standard of home afterwards.
That's a very good point. It's not just risk; it's also the liquidity of the money that will often determine your returns. So, given you want liquidity and you want low risk, the return's probably not going to be high, but that's subjective.
And we all know, finding a home that we want to live in, it sometimes can take longer than 6 months, or, we could find it next week, couldn't we? So okay. Thank you very much, Paul. So before we go to a break, I believe Tony has a little golden nugget, property advice for us, don't you?
Yeah, one of the things we see coming up a lot is, should I use a trust for property? The short answer is no.
Okay.
Trusts aren't what they used to be. Since the changes in the early 2000s, the introduction of relevant property trusts, there are a lot of tax and practical consequences. If the amount you're putting into a trust is more than what's called the nil rate band, currently £325,000, there could be an immediate 20% charge to inheritance tax. 6% payable every 10 years and an exit charge.
Wow, okay.
Income is taxed at the highest possible rates, reduced capital gains tax allowances, annual tax returns. And you have to notify HMRC that you've got it, what's in it, who set it up, who the beneficiaries are, etc. You should still use trust, however, for things like life insurance. It's great. It means it pays out free of tax and without the need for probate. Very widely used to tackle inheritance tax bills, paying it in advance at a discount. Another good reason to use a trust is, let's say you have disadvantaged, disabled relative or somebody who's got a less than easy lifestyle, sex and drugs and rock and roll addiction, whatever. You want to have an income but no capital, then a disabled trust would be a good thing. One thing to be aware, if anybody tells you they can take your home, your principal private residence, out of the inheritance tax trap or avoid long-term care charging by using trusts, run away screaming.
Okay, so really you do need advice on trusts.
One last point there, mortgages is another one.
Okay.
Absolutely. There's very few lenders that will lend to trusts. I think there's 2 off the top of my head.
Wow.
So that's another thing to consider.
Is there anything that's replaced trusts that we... No?
No. Look, trusts go back to the Crusades. When Richard went off to rape and pillage the Holy Land, he trusted people not to do the same to his. And they've been around since then. So really long established principles. However, because they had great tax advantages, and all governments, all chancellors are avaricious and want to restrict how much we can have before paying tax, they've become less and less attractive. If, however, you're a landlord and are looking to minimise tax in order to grow your portfolio and pass on intact to future generations, there are structural things you can do which don't rely on trusts at all.
Great. Thank you so much, Tony. Thank you. We'll be back in just a moment with more questions, including a question about a listed property. So do join us then. Hello there and a warm welcome back to Property Question Time. Joining me today is Marianne Bowering, Tony Gimple and Paul Mahoney, who are answering your property-related questions. We're coming to Paul first, who's MD of Nova Financial, with a little golden nugget to kick us off in this half.
Okay. My golden nugget is about understanding what type of returns is best for you. I'd say the default when it comes to investing in property is income. I suppose generally the end goal is always income, and therefore I suppose it makes sense that the initial goal should be income. Mm-hmm. But if you're looking to grow an asset base, income isn't necessarily the main, or shouldn't necessarily be the main focus. And I'll give you an example. Let's say you've got £50,000 to invest. If you invest that £50,000 solely for income, and let's say you get a 10% net yield, but it doesn't grow in value at all, well, that's going to give you £5,000 a year. If your end goal is £50,000 a year, you're going to have to save 10 lots of £50,000, which for most people is going to be unachievable or is going to take them a very long period of time. If you take that same £50,000 and invest it into a £200,000 property with leverage, and 10 to 15 years later, that £200,000 property is worth £400,000, well, all of a sudden, your 50 is now 250. If you do that a few times, you're going to be, on a pretty decent track toward achieving your end income goal. So an analogy for that is growing an orange and squeezing an orange. You've got a tiny little orange, you're not going to get very much juice. If you've got a nice big juicy orange, you'll get as much juice as you like. So if the goal is to grow an asset base, growth is quite an important focus. You need to make sure you're investing in properties that are going to achieve that. And then I suppose shifting your strategy a bit when it comes time to actually having that asset base more so toward income. Okay,
great. Thank you. I like the orange analogy there. Thank you very much. So first question then in this half to Tony. This is quite an interesting one. A friend has approached me who owns approximately 20 properties throughout England and Scotland. They were originally owned by her husband, who is now sadly deceased, and she doesn't want to retain them. She understands that capital gains tax issues could arise, but she's wondering if there are any companies out there that would be interested in purchasing a portfolio of properties, all of which have tenants, as opposed to selling them off individually. What should she do?
Okay, the CGT thing may be a bit of a red herring, and capital gains tax normally disappears on death in favour of inheritance tax. So that would depend on what's actually happened in the estate. In terms of finding somebody who wants to buy the whole portfolio, yeah, there are portfolio landlords out there who will look at that sort of thing. Not easy. You've got to find them, you've got to have the right agents who can find them on your behalf, and there's obviously a deal to be done. It's more a question of coming back to what she wants to achieve. Does she want the capital? Can the income be replaced? Would it be better, instead of selling them, actually to employ a professional property manager? And therefore the asset stays in the family. She has continuing income. A lot easier probably to deal with from a tax perspective. And if she has children, then that could in time also be made inheritance tax free by employing the right business structure.
Okay, if she did want to find a company who was interested in investing and buying the whole property portfolio, how would she go about doing that?
Oh wow. I think the simple answer is I don't actually know, because there isn't a central market for this sort of thing. She could try speaking with specialist property accountants, see if they've got clients. She could look at the property trade press and take adverts, or do that via an agent. But it's not as if it's something you can find on the Friday ad, or or just going on Google.
An ad. Yeah.
Because it's a pretty small market, and there aren't that many large private portfolio landlords, or institutions for that matter, who will buy that sort of thing.
And it sounds like the properties are quite widely spread as well, so through England and Scotland.
Yeah, it may be better that if she must get rid of them, just as individual lots. Either way, she's going to need some advice.
Seems the best way, if she does want to retain them, is to employ a property
an agent.
manager.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, anything to add on that, guys?
Well, there are a range of property networking events out there, property shows. I'd say if you're going to find someone who has the funds and the ability to buy a portfolio like that, you'd likely find them at an event like that. So that might be a good place to start. Whether you actually find them or not, again, I don't know. Because we're talking 20 properties, it's not a small purchase. But I think at the right price, and if you found the right person, you certainly could potentially find a buyer and sell it in that way.
Yeah, it's a real trust issue though, and if she's not that familiar with the business or knowledgeable about the business, it seems that she will need to take separate
She could
advice.
protect herself by getting professional valuation to establish the worth of the portfolio. That would help people actually bracket down who are the potential targets. And then there is a network of property investment companies. A lot of those are ground rent investors or trading investors, but difficult to find.
Independent advice, I think. Okay, Paul, coming to you, we're moving back to the northwest now, where I know there's a bit of a property boom at the moment, isn't it? I'm thinking of buying a repossessed 4-bedroomed house in Manchester for £350,000. How can I be sure it's good value?
Well, there's a range of considerations to be had there. Manchester's a big place for a start, so it's difficult for me to comment without knowing a bit more information. But there's a range of different paths to follow. If you wanted to find that out yourself, you can look at like-for-like properties in the area. There's a range of online resources which will value a property for you of varying accuracy, I'd say. Of course, you could seek professional advice. Speak with a local estate agent or a few local estate agents or a surveyor. You actually have a valuation done, perhaps. So there are a range of options available to you to help you establish value, which would depend on how committed you are, or how much you want to find out, I suppose. But that would again depend on what you're looking for, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I'd imagine sort of the standard of the property, I mean, the area, there's a whole myriad of reasons there why the property could be worth less or more or whatever.
There are. And repossessed properties aren't necessarily better value. That's another thing to consider. I think, a lot of people assume that if you're buying repossessed or if you're buying a rundown property that you are getting it at good value, but that's not always the case. So certainly exploring some of those paths I mentioned would be worthwhile.
Mainly repossessed properties sold at auction, or are they sold perhaps How do they?
Quite often,
normally
yeah.
sell?
But that's another thing is, again, a lot of people assume that auction properties are better value, where they're not always. Also, a lot of people assume that there's always something wrong with auction properties, where there often is, but again, not always. Auctions, I suppose, just depend on who turns up on the day. So you can't just assume you're going to get a good deal. There are a range of other things to consider there with buying a property like that is, are there any issues with it? What's the mortgage availability like? What's the demand like in the area? So the value isn't the only thing to consider when it comes to buying a property. All too often we see people who feel as though they've got a good deal on a property, but generally when you're getting a good deal, there's a good reason you've got a good deal. So we advise people against buying cheap properties, because they're usually cheap due to a lack of demand, which could be due to a range of different reasons. And if there's a lack of demand for your property, it's probably not going to rent very well, it's probably not going to sell very well, which is really the opposite of what you want.
And there's so much research you can do yourself, isn't there? Online, even just walking around the area yourself, finding out how it feels, what's happening, if the neighbour's house sold for X amount or whatever.
There's a lot of research you can do yourself, but there's also a lot of conflicting information out there. You can almost tie yourself in knots, or paralysis by analysis by going online too much. So I'd say almost in all cases, with something like this, we're talking a pretty big ticket item. Property's usually the most expensive thing you'll ever buy. So it makes sense to seek professional advice when doing that.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Paul. So Marianne, we're coming to you now with our historical question, our listed question. I'm deciding to buy a listed property. What level of survey is necessary? A standard one?
Well, a standard survey doesn't exist as such. There's generally 3 levels. One will be a mortgage valuation. And you've got to remember that is actually for the mortgage company, albeit they have a duty of care for you to rely on it. At best, that is probably a 20-minute inspection of the property, and if you're lucky, a head and shoulders inspection of the roof void. So definitely not that one. The next level up is a home buyers survey, which is kind of written in conjunction with the RICS and Which magazine. So it's consumer-based, quite easy to understand, but again, it's generally written to focus on 2 factors, things that are urgent and things that are significant. Urgent means you should do something about it before you purchase, and significant means that it has an impact on price.
Okay.
The third level of survey you should do is called a building survey or a full building survey, and definitely if you're buying a listed property, that's what you want. That will look at every element of construction. So if you basically start from the top down, chimneys, roofs, flashings, guttering, walls, windows, wall plates, floors, and I could keep going right down to the drain. It'll also look at the situation properties in more detail. So are there trees affecting drains, which could affect movement to the property? And in a listed building, there's going to be lots of tricks that you will only really understand how to follow the trail of suspicion if you understand how the building is constructed. And a building surveyor will have expertise to do that, whereas a valuation surveyor who normally carries out perhaps a mortgage valuation or a home buyer survey won't have had that level of training. Just as an example, the Victorians and the Georgians, a lot of those, Georgian properties, a lot of them are quite listed now. They would have used what's called a timber wall plate, basically a long piece of timber to straighten the brickwork before they then nailed the frame for the window to it. So that wall plate is actually stuck behind your plaster within your brickwork. And if that over the years gets damp and deteriorates, that's why you'll often see stepped cracking on a window arch because the timber behind it has rotted.
Okay.
So that's the sort of thing that you need to look for. There'll also be specific places, perhaps in the floor construction, where there'll be a sleeper wall, so little brick piers which are holding your timbers. Your timbers are stuck into your walls. In a modern house, your timbers would be hung in metal brackets, so your timbers are not actually embedded into walls. Anything that's embedded into walls are at risk because walls get damp, moist, deterioration, and the biggest threat to these types of properties from inside is damp ingress and timbers losing their structural strength. The biggest threats outside, of course, will be clay pipes in drainage runs as opposed to a new build with plastic pipes which are less easy to permeate. So it's about understanding the factors and wanting to know that someone's analysed all of those things.
Great. So a fully comprehensive survey is advised, I would imagine. Yeah.
Yeah, it's about understanding the construction type. You should phone up the surveyor and you should sort of say, you know, what experience do you have of this property, this road, this location, because they should be talking to you in the sort of detail that I have to make you feel, oh yes, they understand this type of property.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm a qualified surveyor, but I personally would never do a survey on a thatched property.
Yeah.
I don't do properties built in the 1500s and Tudor era because I haven't done enough of them and I don't feel competent to do them. So it's about getting the right surveyor for the class of property who feels they know the area. A building surveyor should also know about underground streams. There's loads in London, believe it or not, buried. And also the nature of the soil, which will impact on the foundation depth. And let's not forget that even in the Victorian era, it was almost, if you don't have a basement, it was 5 or 6 bricks and let's start building up.
Wow, okay. A lot to consider. Just briefly, Marianne, you have a little nugget for us, just following on from that, don't you? Just to round off today's show.
Yeah, there's a common misnomer about listed buildings. In the old days, the councils used to list a facet of the building. So perhaps they had a building which has some particularly beautiful tiling in it, they would list the tiling within the building. But perhaps to make it easier for the authorities that be, now once your building is listed, it's the entirety of it. So even if I want to put a garden gate in my garden wall, and my garden wall is nothing more special than your garden wall, because my building is listed, the whole entity is listed, including the garden wall. So I'd have to then get planning permission to make any changes. You also need to think about the grade of listing, because the grade of listing depends on how easy it's going to be to do anything. And on certain properties, English heritage will definitely be involved. And the other often misknown thing is buildings can be locally listed. That's where perhaps a local community group feels the building is of historic interest locally and nominates it to be listed. And again, that can frustrate any process to get planning permission. So there's listing at national level, English heritage led, and there's listing at local level, local authority led.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed talking to you this afternoon. And thank you for joining us. Don't forget, if you have any questions, property related, just send them to us here. I'll give you the email address. It's info@property-tv.co.uk, or you can download our Property TV app. I look forward to seeing you very soon. Bye-bye.